You're running this.
Yeah. Trying to help.
Lewis, could you set up our lecture 4? Lewis, are you still back there?
Yep.
Not me.
This is a little bit different computer than the one that I use, so you don't want to mess it up. We can go to number 4. Yeah, thanks. Thanks. I should have said this at the very beginning this morning, but I must say it now, and that is the views that I'm going to represent are purely mine. Please do not think that this is what the Smithsonian thinks, or my university, or anybody other than me. I'm going to give you my own version of things I think about what's going on now. I'm deeply involved in all of this. Ruth said that I'd had 3 Fulbright grants. My last one was last year. I spent the first 5 months of the year mostly in St. Petersburg, but I also traveled to the far north, to the Kola Peninsula a couple of times, and I went all the way across Siberia on the railroad, as well to Vladivostok. Somebody had a question or something? Yes.
Do you speak Russian, or do you travel with an interpreter?
I speak Russian, yes. My wife is Russian, she's here today, and we speak Russian at home more than we speak English at home, so I use Russian quite a bit. I'm not absolutely fluent in it, but fairly close to that. People often think that I emigrated from Russia maybe 20 years ago, and I'm just a little bit rusty, but they'll get me back. So, you notice the title on this one. The main title, The Russia That Just Won't Go Away, and of course now Russia still has not gone away. And this is dealing more with the contemporary world. Lots of stuff that could be said. Most of it probably should not be said. But again, this is going to be a fun lecture, I hope. There's an expression now that the Russians have. Russians never give up. Russians never give in. And foreigners need to remember that. Bears wake up slowly, but when they wake up, you better watch out. I tried to find something that did all of this humorously, and the best I could come up with was a bear playing a balalaika. That's the best that I could do. But you see, Russians can solve problems in all kinds of ways. You see that bear that's trying to get at something to eat from a bird feeder because he's having a hungry time. And this other one, you see these 2 guys and a bear are pushing a car through some mud. Is it really true that in your country there are bears walking in the streets? And the answer to that is, hell, who says we even have streets? Russian sense of humor. You gotta love them. That's not Photoshopped. How gullible are we? The background is from a famous painting by a man who loved to paint the northern Russian forests. His name was Ivan Ivanovich Shishkin. Shishkin is a great last name for him to have, because a shishka, among other things, is a pine cone. And he often painted pine forests, but he wasn't any good at bears. So he always got a friend to come paint the bears. And he liked to have bears in his paintings, and he's a favorite artist of a lot of Russians. When I go through the Russian Museum in St. Petersburg and I get to the room where Shishkin's paintings are, I watch Russians as they come into this room. And of course, you're absorbing so much when you're in an art museum, and you're thinking so much, and you're a little bit tense and all of this, and they get into the room where Shishkin is, and because this is Russia. I mean, Shishkin's paintings look like Russia, Russian landscapes. And yeah, it was photoshopped a little bit. But you know, Putin doesn't only ride bears. Yes?
Does he have his cross on in that?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, he does have his cross on. Putin doesn't only ride bears. He rides giraffes. Dolphins for him are nothing. Little puppy dogs, he'll ride on them. Dinosaurs. In fact, did you catch him at the Olympics when he beat Usain Bolt? And he's just strolling, and Usain Bolt is running as fast as he can. And then you should have seen him, he caught 2 sharks and dragged them ashore. And no comment on the last one. But I found this on a Russian site. Rather comical, isn't it? But you know, Putin never liked wearing shirts. And all these people say, oh, he's doing this macho thing. And no, Putin just doesn't like to wear shirts. I found this picture of him as a teenager. Okay, they've been out chopping wood. He and his buddy outside town. He's never wanted to wear a shirt. He doesn't have a shirt on there either. But of course, is it Russia that's in the news, or is it Putin that's in the news? Is Putin Russia? Is Russia Putin? I mean, it's really hard to say, isn't it? All of the stuff that's been said about Putin. And of course, he's been caricatured and demonized in so many different ways by all kinds of people in cartoons and doctored photographs and the whole bit. I mean, this is sort of the image we have in this country, isn't it? Of Vladimir Putin, or Putler. Some people call him Putler, right? I've seen that in a number of blogs and other things. But of course, the West hasn't always looked at Putin that way. You remember that famous time, the meeting in Slovakia when Putin and Bush, and Putin is good friends with Gerhard Schröder. They're quite good friends. In fact, last year when Schröder turned 70, Putin invited him to come to St. Petersburg to celebrate his 70th birthday. He said, we'll have a nice birthday bash. And on Russian television, I watched as he got out of his car. He'd come in from the airport, he got out of his car, Putin was there to meet him. The two guys threw their arms around each other, gave each other a big hug. I mean, it wasn't Brezhnev's kiss on the mouth that he used to do with the leader of East Germany. And then with their arms on each other's shoulders, they walked. In fact, back when he was in power in the early 90s, he was visiting St. Peter, or I guess right after Putin became president, 2000 or 2001. They went into a small bar in St. Petersburg. It was a joint enterprise. It had been started by some Germans together with some Russians. They went in to drink beer. And they told their bodyguards to stay outside. And so these two guys just walked into this bar. It's not a joke. Two guys walked into a bar, and they sat down, and people in the bar started looking around and said, wait a minute, doesn't that guy look a lot like Putin? Who's the other guy? Oh, he looks a lot like Gerhard Schröder. They sat there for about an hour. They drank a beer and had a conversation, just the two of them, and then they got up and walked out. Nobody ever saw a bodyguard inside the place. Bodyguards stayed outside. And they got a round of applause as they were leaving, because they hadn't made any deal about it. The reason they came in was that this had been a joint enterprise started by some West Germans and some Russians. And then this is when Russia was first becoming a part of the G7, it was becoming the G8. You know, Putin, he's one of the guys, right? He's part of the group. I guess, yeah, they were still all guys then. But he's a part of the group. This was the early view of Putin. You know, Russia wasn't seen right then maybe as being so dangerous. But keep all of this in mind, this stuff that had been going on. It's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and you couldn't call it that had this country not become a member of it, because that basically is the North Atlantic, isn't it? Norway, 600 miles of coastline. The Norwegians almost did not become a part of NATO. You know, they really debated this a lot, just as they really debated becoming a part of the EU. And eventually they decided not to become a part of the EU, and they're not in it. And by about the same slim majority, they had decided back in 1949 to become a part of NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as it was called then, we don't ever call it that anymore. You could hardly call it that after 1952. And is it the North Atlantic Treaty Organization if Turkey is a member of it? That's hardly North Atlantic. And Greece had to come in at the same time because the Greeks and the Turks don't like each other. And we really wanted the Turks in it because they allowed us to get closer to the Soviet Union where we could do some damage. And so, of course, we had to bring the Greeks in as well, even though we maybe didn't really like the Greek government at that period of time. But in any event, there was no more expansion after 1955 when West Germany was brought in until 1982, Spain came in. after Franco died. Franco had to die, and then you have to make sure that this government's really going to last. So Spain comes in, but it's basically a fairly solid membership until you get to 1990. In 1990, you've got this issue. If the wall comes down, if Germany's going to be reunited, then what happens to East Germany? You've got over 300,000 Soviet troops in East Germany. What's going to happen? Well, obviously the West is economically, population, in all ways, it's the bigger part of Germany. So Germany, if it's going to be united, it's still going to be a part of NATO. You're not going to throw it out of NATO. And so what you had to do is get the Soviets, it was still the Soviet Union, you have to get them to agree to it. So James Baker, Secretary of State, flew to Moscow to talk to Gorbachev about it. And apparently, at least the Russians have always said since then, that the promise was made, nothing was written down, but the promise was made that if you'll look the other way and you'll get all of your troops out of the eastern part of Germany, give up all of the bases there voluntarily, then we're not going to expand any more than that. That's as far as NATO is going to go. This was apparently the deal that was made in 1990. And you could even ask at that time in 1990, did you really need NATO anymore, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was set up in order to prevent the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe? Well, we found out in the late 1980s that they never had plans to invade Western Europe through the Fulda Gap. A friend of mine, an American scholar, worked in the Russian military archives, and he said they had no plans to do all of that. All of our military doctrine about their coming through the Fulda Gap and then spreading out through all of Western Europe, this was our fear, but the Russians never had plans to do that. The Soviets never had plans to do that. But in any event, it came up for renewal after 20 years, 1969. It came up for renewal, 1969. What was the context right then? Well, the United States is involved in Vietnam, but in Europe, in 1968, the Prague Spring had been put down by the Soviet Union. Not with as much brutality as Hungary in 1956, but yeah, there's still a need for NATO if they're going to go in and crack down on Eastern European countries like they did in Czechoslovakia. So NATO was renewed in 1969 for another 20 years. That gets you to 1989. What happened in 1989? Gorbachev permitted Eastern Europe to go its own way. Every one of the countries of Eastern Europe, and in fact the Warsaw Pact, ceased to exist. The Warsaw Pact, which had been created to counter NATO, it no longer existed. So what's NATO going to do? What's the purpose of NATO? Well, you've got to find a new one, don't you? You certainly can't turn all of those people loose from their jobs in Brussels, and you can't sell all of those buildings to somebody else. You know, when you built a structure like this, you've got to keep it and you've got to assign it something else to do. Well, Gorbachev raises the question, well, if we're not the threat anymore, why don't we join NATO too? If it's looking for a new source, we want to bring security to all of the world. Let's extend Europe all the way from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Oh no. Oh no, you guys can't be in that club. Anybody else can be in the club. But anytime Russia tried to become a part of the club, even when supposedly Russia was nobody's enemy, Russia always gets turned down. And look what happened the next year. Right, not the next year, a long time later, 2001. We all remember September the 11th, don't we? Do you remember that one of the first countries to respond, to give their condolences, was Russia? Putin called President Bush. And the Russians were now saying to themselves that the Americans now understand what we've been having to deal with, because they are now having to confront the same kind of issue that we've been having to confront with Chechnya and in some other areas. And the Russians virtually invited NATO into air bases that had been set up by the Soviet Union. They were no longer Soviet air bases because they were in the stands. But NATO couldn't get to Afghanistan to bomb it without having bases in the stands. And the Russian government made it very clear to the governments of Central Asia that it's okay with us, even though the entire Russian government was opposed to it. Their defense minister said, we can't imagine any circumstance, even hypothetical, when NATO would be allowed into Central Asia. This is what the Russian Minister of Defense had to say, Sergei Ivanov, at the time. 2 days later, Putin called together everybody in the government and said, we're going to let NATO in. We're going to let the Americans in. He countered his entire government. And then he went to the next NATO meeting in Brussels. This had been an enormous concession. Now, what is Russia going to be given in exchange for this huge concession? And Putin says, well, why don't maybe we become members of NATO? And they were told, oh, you don't just become a member of NATO, you have to apply for admission to become a member of NATO. To which Putin's response seemed to be, we're not going to stand in line with a bunch of little countries that don't really matter. So turned down again and again and again, as NATO is expanding against whom or against what? And where is it expanding? We'll come back to that slide in a little bit. But September, Putin almost immediately went to burn a candle to pray for the souls of those who'd been killed. Do you know this memorial in Bayonne, New Jersey? This was a gift of the Russian government, the Russian people, really, it was the government, to the American people. Our common fight against terrorism. They offered it first to Jersey City, and Jersey City turned it down. And then Bayonne accepted it, but it's in a former industrial site in Bayonne, New Jersey. It was put up, it was built at the personal cost of a Russian sculptor. It received a lot of criticism from the United States for oh so gauche, oh so tasteless. It looks like a soggy biscuit from the side, and so on. It's a wall that's been cracked and a teardrop. And on these slabs are the names of all of the people that were known at the time. A few have since been taken off. A few people we now know didn't die, but the names are still there. Of all the people who died in the Twin Towers. And it's not quite a straight line, but it's almost a straight line through the Statue of Liberty. Statue of Liberty is just a little bit off, but to where the World Trade Center was, where this tower was put up. Zurab Tsereteli was the sculptor who put all of this up. In the year 2000, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey said they were going to have to move this because they wanted to put a container thing here. And then there was a campaign not to do that. It was led by a taxi driver in Bayonne, New Jersey, and the statue is still there. Although Putin's face, these are laser printed into the stone. Putin's face has now been covered up with something, a cloth has been dropped in. You've got Bush on one side and Putin on the other. The common fight against terrorism. How much were we told about this in the United States? That the Russians have given this monument. You can find it. You know, I Googled it and it's there on Google Map. It's called Teardrop Memorial, is what they call it, and it's still there. But isn't it rather interesting, the relation? I mean, Russia went so far out of its way in September and after September 2001. And what? We won't quite call it a slap in the face, but it's almost a slap, particularly when the announcement was made, well, it's got to be moved someplace else, we're going to take it down. And then it was a local campaign by some people. Bayonne, New Jersey is where it is. Well, Putin initially really benefited from the world economy. Not much has been said about the effects on bringing down the Soviet Union of the world price of oil, upon which the Soviet government had become quite dependent in the 1980s for balancing the budget, and the world price of oil dropped way down and stayed down all through the 90s. Yeltsin was really unlucky. All through the 90s, the price of oil is very, very low. And then almost as soon as Putin becomes president, at the beginning of 2000, the price of oil goes up and up and up and up. And as you know, it eventually got to, what, $140 a barrel. And more recently, it's now dropped down, and it's somewhere between around $50 a barrel, something like that. From 45 to 58 is usually what the range is. Historic oil prices. This gives you some idea of the economic growth that began to take place in Russia under Putin. If we wonder, why did the Russians like Putin? Well, this is one reason, because suddenly there is the growth of the economy. And it was Ronald Reagan, I think, who said it's better to be lucky than to be good. I think he named his dog Lucky, and he may have known what he was talking about. I don't know, but one of the first things Putin had to do was to deal with the oligarchs. because these oligarchs had essentially run Russia during the 1990s. They had gotten the laws they wanted. They wanted a particular law, they just marched right into Yeltsin's office and they got it. They were used to buying the government. Putin didn't like the idea of a few very, very wealthy people or a few very, very wealthy corporations dictating what the laws were going to be in a country. He didn't much like that at all. So in 2001, they met about once a month, and in 2001, he essentially announced to them that you guys need to stay out of politics. And they all felt comfortable with that in 2001. If you stick to business, let somebody else stick to politics. As I said, they pretty much agreed with that, but then it was Khodorkovsky later on who began to violate that agreement. Part of what happened was when world oil prices were going up and up and up and up, one of the first things Putin did when he got in office, nobody paid their taxes. People who had money, people who were getting money, didn't pay their taxes. And so Putin asked his economic advisors, what are we going to do about this? And what they decided to do, because nobody was paying taxes when taxes were fairly high, they said, let's lower the rate to just a ridiculously low level, and maybe they'll pay their taxes. So Russia instituted across-the-board tax, income tax, 13%. 13%. They've had it ever since. He called all the oligarchs in. He said, this is what we're going to do. We've done all the paperwork. We think it's going to work. But you guys have to start paying your taxes. And so that's what they were doing. They were paying taxes. Taxes on corporations were a little bit higher than that, but still under 20%. Well, now as the prices on oil are going up and up and up and up, the oil companies and the gas companies are making money hand over fist. They're making tons of money. And so the government decided it needed to get its hands on some of that money. We would call it in this country an excess profits tax, right? And we've had such tax, excess profits tax, when somewhere people are making all kinds of money, and it's only going into their pocket, not going into the common pocket. And so they tried to get this law through the Duma. And the big oil companies, led by Khodorkovsky, informed the government the night before the bill was going to be brought up before the Duma, we want you to know this bill is going to fail. We have gotten to the members of the parliament, and they will not vote for it. Which means they bribed them not to vote for it. And so the government didn't even bring the bill up. And so these companies made more and more and more money. Money you can agree or disagree with the policy, but the government felt as though, once again, these oligarchs had done what was good for them and not good for everybody else in the country, because the tax money certainly could have been put to good use. And then when Khodorkovsky in other ways began clearly opposing, it was Khodorkovsky's company that led the way in all of this, Putin had him arrested. Let's see if I've got that one here. Well, no, before I get to that, this is a little bit more about how Putin was initially viewed. Those are fairly positive photographs, aren't they? Time magazine made him the person of the year in 2002. He looks like a rather studious man, a man who's trying to do good things, and so on and so on and so on. But then comes the arrest of Khodorkovsky in 2003. As I told you earlier, Khodorkovsky was hoping to merge his company with ExxonMobil. This is before the current Secretary of State was at the very top. Somebody else was president of ExxonMobil. But he was arrested on various corruption charges. He had set up this company, Yukos, which is one of the biggest companies in the world, one of the richest companies in the world. And he had made an awful lot of his money illegally, as they all had, in the 1990s. And there was some evidence that maybe a few people had been murdered along the way who might have been opposition. Not that he would have done it, but conveniently the mayor of a city who's opposed to some policy gets murdered at some point. These were some of his businesses. Menatep in particular was a bank that he ran, and so he was arrested and a trial was produced against him. I know of a town in the far north of Russia. It's a mining town, and he bought this mining town in the 1990s. I'm currently writing a history of this small town, and I can't get people there to talk to me about this period of time. They just say it was really bad. We weren't paid our wages. We continued to work. Everything was stolen from us. And in fact, the case that was prepared against him, the legal case prepared against him, had to do largely with how his company had run this town, or one of his companies had run that town. This was much of the case brought against him, and certainly was corroborated to me by the people who lived there. that they didn't feel they were treated very legally by Khodorkovsky. So he ended up getting a fairly long prison term. Conditions were not that bad for him, really, because he continued to write op-ed pieces periodically that were published in the Wall Street Journal, which would not have happened had he been in the Stalinist camp. I don't think I wouldn't have had anything published in the Wall Street Journal. Chechnya, of course, was another issue that Putin dealt with, and he didn't find an ideal solution, but there wasn't an ideal solution. And at least he came up with a solution so that there is no more war in Chechnya. There are still events from place to place, the so-called Black Widow suicide bombings. There haven't been any of those now for a few years, but suicide bombings by women whose husbands had died on the Chechen side. The Domodedovo airport, one of the 3 international airports in Moscow, somebody walked into the suitcase and set it down and walked back out. 20-some people were killed in the explosion. Russia being Russia, they just curtained that part of the airport off, and the airport continued to function. You know, they just didn't use that little bit of the airport while they were working on the case. So Putin was able to deal with all of that. When he was elected for the second term in 2004, he announced that now that Russia is making all this money back, now that Russia has some money, we're able to pay off the debts. And incidentally, Russia had assumed all of the debts of the old Soviet Union. None of the other republics, you don't have to assume any of the debts, no matter who you are, how many people you've got, how big your economy is. Russia will assume all of that, the debts of the old Soviet Union, and they were pretty large. But in return for that, Russia was going to get the veto in the Security Council, the permanent membership in the Security Council, and not any of the other republics. It stood to reason maybe Russia, as the largest component of the Soviet Union, should get that. And so Putin announced at the beginning of his second term that out of all of this pot of money that we are now accumulating, we're going to turn to these 4 issues. And these were the 4 areas where he said we really need to improve because things slid so badly back in the 2000s. And they began to improve things in various kinds of ways. In public health, they began setting up clinics with 1 or 2 beds in very small towns so that you could go to the clinic if need be, and then you could be sent on to a hospital someplace else. They raised the wages of doctors who worked in very small places. As we know, that's a problem in our country as well, getting doctors to go to very, very small towns where they don't want to have to go. And this is one way of trying to deal with that in Russia. In education, they began for the first time to pour money back into education, which had been stinted all through the 90s. Teachers hadn't been paid salaries. Schools had been allowed to deteriorate. 3 years ago now, I guess it is, or maybe 2 years ago, I was on the border between Russia and Mongolia, and I wanted to go to a little town that at one time had been important, but hasn't been for a long time. And so I was permitted to go and spend a couple of nights there, and I stayed with the high school principal and her husband, and they took me on a tour through the school. This is a little border town with Mongolia. It's off the beaten track. Doesn't need to be a show place of any kind, because nobody goes there. But this was a school, it held 1,000 students through all of the grades, and it had all the bells and whistles you would want in a school. Computers for the students. I talked with the biology teacher. She told me how pleased she was with what she had. Everything new, everything nice, everything really wonderful. This is not urban. This is not in the middle of someplace. This is in the middle of no place. Tourists never go there. And in fact, you had to have special permission to get there, which they didn't get for me. And I said, won't I get in trouble? And they said, oh no, we'll take the back road. They never checked the back road. The reason why it was right on the border. And you're not supposed to be in a border zone unless you have special permission. And then as we were leaving, it was night when we went in, we were leaving in the daytime, and they said if we happen to see any car coming, because it's out in the middle of no place, if we see any car coming, you just duck down so they can't see you. And if they see 2 heads, they know us, and they won't worry about you. Housing, agriculture, this is what the country began to turn to, investing in these areas where they knew they needed to make investments. And this is some stuff about, shoot, I'm not an economist, maybe some of you are, but you can see growth and lack of growth of the economy. Ooh, I'm still going in the wrong direction, am I not? Let me go back. No, I'm going in the wrong way. It's only going in the wrong way. Let's go back. Nope. Sorry, folks. Where do we go? Where do we go? We want to go. It's going only in the wrong direction. Okay, now you've seen the lecture, we can go home. No, come on, I'm showing all the good stuff. Sorry, it's not reversing itself when it should. Let's start all over again. you remember what I said on all these? And I've also lost the fact that it's full screen, and don't know how to bring it up here. Lewis, are you back there?
Anybody here know how to do that?
Okay.
Come on, one of you's got to be
Where's
clued.
this one? Will do it? Yeah, but if this was a computer. Oh, hit it on the computer.
Here we are. Here we are.
Okay. That was not supposed to do this.
Lucas is coming.
And he is Russian.
Okay, there it is. Yes, he's Russian. So, all right, that's true. We can move forward from there. Tell me when to stop, and I'll know if you've been paying attention.
Thank you very much. You're a good man. Yes.
Okay, that's where we were, and we can move on to the next one. There's a couple of murders, and when the Western attitude towards Putin began to change, it started with the arrest of Khodorkovsky. Khodorkovsky, when he got involved in politics, he did a really smart thing. He set up an international foundation. He said that my company is going to be an absolutely transparent company. Well, now that he's gotten all of the wealth together, it was certainly not transparent as he was building it, but I'm going to have a transparent company, and he named to this Human Rights Board and all kinds of people, all kinds of important folks, including Henry Kissinger and other people, so he knew what he was doing in creating a climate to have sympathy for himself if the government cracked down on it. And the government cracked down, but in the West, of course, this is all Putin is bad. Although I'd say 97 to 98% of the Russian population, when they were polled and asked, what do you think about the arrest of Khodorkovsky? Their answer was, why only him? All of them should be arrested. And of course, this is why, in some sense, it was called a political trial, because all of them weren't arrested. Only the one who had opposed Putin was arrested. But looking at it from Putin's point of view, if you arrest all of them, what is this going to do to the way the economy functions? If you can't break up all of the companies. Remember what Robespierre said in the French Revolution. You had to cut off a few heads pour encourager les autres, in order to encourage everybody else to behave properly. Anna Politkovskaya was killed in October of 2006. She was a journalist. She was an opponent of Putin. But even more so, she was an opponent of Kadyrov, Ramzan Kadyrov. A week before she was murdered, she had had an interview with Kadyrov. He had allowed her to interview him in Chechnya, and she had asked him some questions that had so infuriated him that he stormed out of the room and brought the interview to an end. So I think it's quite likely that some of Kadyrov's people may really have been the ones who were responsible for Anna Politkovskaya's death. So what's Putin going to do? Do you replace Kadyrov? People were put on trial. They were Chechens. They've been tried. We don't know who gave the orders. It probably was Kadyrov or someone around Kadyrov. He didn't have to give the orders. Remember Henry II? Will no one rid me of that Saxon priest? Speaking of Thomas à Becket, and somebody got the idea. It may well be that someone wanted to do what he thought would make Kadyrov like him a whole lot. It's a bad situation, but again, what do you do? What do you blame Putin for in all of this? Are the consequences of his doing something else going to be far worse for the country? You start another war in which thousands and thousands of people die. Isn't there a line somewhere in the Bible? It was better that one man should die and all of the people not have to suffer. I don't know. I hate to make those I'm not making that kind of a moral decision. And then, of course, there's this case of Alexander Litvinenko in London, polonium. I don't know if are there any physicists in the audience? Somebody needs to explain to me why the man who carried the polonium with him for 3 weeks never got sick. I've always wondered, why didn't he get sick? If every airplane seat he sat in, every restaurant he went into left traces of polonium, why didn't he ever even have to go to the hospital? Did he not get enough of the dosage from it? Even though it left a trace everywhere he went, did he, keeping it with him on or near his body for nearly 3 weeks? Whoever the murderer was, I don't know. But it just, I need to have a physicist explain it to me later, maybe not right now. Litvinenko had lots of enemies. And there was a former barrister in England who has now said, he's announced that Putin was guilty of all of this, although I don't think there was any defense mustered in the little trial that he had. There was no argument for the defense that was set up. He was on the payroll of Boris Berezovsky, who was an opponent of Putin. There's evidence that Litvinenko worked for 3 different foreign intelligence services simultaneously. The man might not have known really who he was himself, if he's working for all of these different people at cross purposes. He himself had a lot of contacts in Chechnya. He was reported before he died, before he became sick, he was reported to have been collecting what the Russians call kompromat on all kinds of people in different places around the world, including some in London, including Berezovsky, who was paying for the house that he and his wife lived in. It's a very, very complicated case, to my mind. And I think you have to prove a whole lot more to me that Vladimir Putin was personally responsible for the death of Litvinenko. It was, of course, a case that was used powerfully against Putin by people, including Berezovsky. Berezovsky himself ended up dead in 2013. He apparently was hanged, and the coroner said he hanged himself from a shower curtain in a bathroom that was locked from the inside. But there are very few people who knew him at all who believed that he would have ever killed himself. They think he was murdered by somebody. I don't know. No accusation has ever been made of Russians having killed him, except a lot of Russians think they know who killed him, and I won't tell you who. But these violent deaths, and there were other violent deaths as well of other people. Putin made a speech in Munich at a security conference. It was the 43rd annual security conference in Munich. And I've got a different quotation here from a quotation that I often use when I'm talking about Putin, because I went back and read the speech again. This was taken as being a strongly anti-Western speech. And he got all kinds of criticism for this speech. But I want to read through it a little bit. This is some of what he said, but this captures the flavor of what he was saying. Only 2 decades ago, the world was ideologically and economically divided, and it was the huge strategic potential of 2 superpowers that ensured global security. That's probably true. Soviet Union, the United States, and each of us with our pets. This global standoff pushed the sharpest economic and social problems to the margins of the international communities and the world's agenda. And just like any war, the Cold War left us with live ammunition, figuratively speaking. I'm referring to ideological stereotypes, double standards, and other typical aspects of Cold War bloc thinking. The unipolar world that had been proposed after the Cold War did not take place either. You recall Francis Fukuyama's end of history argument. The history of humanity certainly has gone through unipolar periods and seen aspirations to world supremacy. And what hasn't happened in world history? However, what is a unipolar world? However one might embellish this term, at the end of the day it refers to one type of situation, namely, one center of authority, one center of force, one center of decision-making. It is a world in which there is one master, one sovereign. And at the end of the day, this is pernicious not only for all those within the system, but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys itself from within. This is Putin speaking 10 years ago. And this certainly has nothing in common with democracy. Because, as you know, democracy is the power of the majority in light of the interests and opinions of the minority. Interesting definition, isn't it, of democracy? Incidentally, Russia, we, are constantly being taught about democracy. But for some reason, those who teach us do not want to learn themselves. And he goes on and says a number of things about invading other countries and so on and so on and so on. And this was taken as being a speech extremely hostile to the West when Putin made it in 2007. That is, in the West it was taken as being extremely hostile to the West. A speech has been quoted very often. And then, of course, after that, in 2008, you had this crisis with Georgia. Putin was no longer president at this point. Putin, when this little conflict broke out, beginning of August 2008, Putin was in Beijing for the beginning of the Olympics. And the Russian president Dmitry Medvedev, was on vacation. And on Saturday night, the 7th of August, suddenly Grad missiles began raining down on South Ossetia, the southern part of South Ossetia, which is where the population is. They're not up in the mountains. This is South Ossetia. South Ossetia was a part of Georgia. It had been made a part of Georgia when Georgia became a part of the Soviet Union in the early 1920s. Why was Georgia in the Soviet Union? The Georgians had their own independent government in 1920. It was socialist, Mensheviks. I had the question earlier about what happened to the Mensheviks. It was a Menshevik government, so it was a Marxist government. The Red Army had gone into two other Caucasian states, Azerbaijan and Armenia, which were governed by nationalist governments, and had defeated the nationalist governments to bring them back into the new Soviet Russia as they had been a part of the Russian Empire. Stalin was equal to the commander of that army. He was the political commissar of that army at the commander's level. Stalin also wanted to bring Georgia back into the Soviet Union. Most of the other people among the Bolshevik leadership opposed the idea. But Stalin, who is himself a Georgian, is the one who wants Georgia in. And so Stalin got the idea. It caused a huge foo-for-all in Moscow. And at the next party congress, in fact it was a party congress away, they decided to bring this issue up. What should have really happened, and should Stalin be punished for what he did? Lenin by that time had had a stroke, and Lenin was basically non-functional. But Lenin was opposed to what Stalin had done in bringing Georgia into the Soviet Union. And so he called in Trotsky, and he asked Trotsky, I want you to speak for me. You're a very good speaker, the best speaker we have. I want you to tell everybody what Lenin thinks. Trotsky was such a proud man that he would not tell everybody this is what Lenin thinks. And he said that to Lenin. He said, I'm not going to be your stalking horse. If you want to talk to them, you get somebody else to do it. I'll tell them what Trotsky thinks. And Trotsky thinks it's a bad idea for Georgia to have been brought in. But it was Stalin, a Georgian, who brought Georgia into the Soviet Union. So that's how Georgia ends up in the Soviet Union. It was Stalin. The rest of the leadership was probably pretty much opposed to it. But within Georgia, Georgia had very rarely been a single country. Usually there had been several different kingdoms in Georgia, and sometimes the same guy was king of more than one of them at a time. And there was one guy in the 1700s who was a king 5 different times of one or another or 2 of these kingdoms. So what I'm saying is Georgia was never a single entity. Very rarely since the Middle Ages, only under Queen Tamara. And there were some areas that were in Georgia but weren't really sure they wanted to be in Georgia. One of these was Abkhazia, which is on the Black Sea coast. This is where Jason sought the Golden Fleece. Jason came here for the Golden Fleece, and that's where he found it. There's gold up in them there hills and the riverbeds. And they often used sheep. They would drag a sheep fleece through the river bottom, and it would sometimes come with flecks of gold in it, which may be the origins of that story. And then another region was South Ossetia. These 2 areas didn't really want to be in Georgia, but where are you going to put them? Where are you going to put them? And so Lenin and others made the decision, well, if we're going to have Georgia, these areas will be a part of the Republic of Georgia, but they will be autonomous. That is, they won't be fully a part of Georgia, they'll be autonomous within Georgia. So that's how the deal was set up. And that's what it stayed all through the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell apart, the man who became the first president of Georgia, a man named Gamsa-Khurdia, I met him just before the Soviet Union fell apart. Gamsa-Khurdia decided he was going to fully integrate those 2 back into Georgia. They hadn't been a part of Georgia ever, certainly not during Soviet years. A civil war broke out. Gamsa-Khurdia got killed. It wasn't clear whether he was killed by his own people or the other people. And the man who then came in and rescued the situation was Edvard Shevardnadze, who had been Gorbachev's foreign minister and face to the world. Very good friend of James Baker. He became the president, and he immediately said, no, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they stay autonomous. Well, he was in until the early 2000s when this man, Saakashvili, became president. And he immediately tried to do, among other things, the same thing that Gamsa-Khurdia had done and failed. That is to bring these 2 areas, again, integrate them fully into Georgia. Gamsa-Khurdia had also been strongly supported by the United States. The United States had spent a good deal to help get him elected as president of Georgia. He has a PhD from Harvard. He became the president of Georgia. Saakashvili's government was quite corrupt. His was going to be clean. It was not. Georgia is Georgia. Politics remained pretty corrupt in Georgia. But he insisted, and NATO began to give a lot of support to him. His army was fully equipped by NATO. And August the 7th, 2008, he decided he was going to bring this area back into Georgia by firing all of these Grad and Scud missiles into this area. Well, there were Russian peacekeepers there who had been there ever since the fighting had happened in the early 1990s. Why am I going into all of this background? Because it's a complicated story. And these people, they realized suddenly that these missiles that couldn't be targeted are hitting schools, they're hitting hospitals, they're hitting apartment buildings. Why has this all of a sudden started? Why is this shooting taking place? And there were also a few people from Western Europe who were there. They ran outside and they saw the missiles are coming from Georgia. They're not coming from anyplace else. Well, there were Russian troops on the other side of the border who were finishing up some training exercises, and they were close enough. There's a tunnel that goes through the mountains here. They quickly came around to try to bring the fighting to an end. And what they did was to drive the Georgian army back to the city of Gori, which is right here, it's Stalin's birthplace. Saakashvili thought they were going to take over all of Georgia, and he's screaming to the world that Russia's going to take over all of Georgia. That's not what they intended to do. They stopped in Gori, and then slowly they pulled back, and now they are sitting protecting South Ossetia from being attacked again. Saakashvili, instead of becoming extremely popular because he took on the Russians, became very unpopular in his own country for his corruption. And by the time he finished his term in office, he had to leave because he was getting ready to be tried for corruption. And so he moved to Brooklyn. He lived in Brooklyn for a while until a few years ago he was tapped by, 2 years ago he was tapped by the new president of Ukraine to become the governor of Odessa, Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. He doesn't speak Ukrainian, Saakashvili, but he went to Ukraine and he suddenly decided that he'd make a better president of Ukraine than the president of Ukraine. And he began to challenge people in Ukraine, and he got thrown out last December from Ukraine. Here's a picture of him somebody made as he's coming into JFK. He's put on a lot of weight, coming back into JFK Airport last January. He's recently gone back into Ukraine, although he's a man now with no passport. He has no Georgian passport, no Ukrainian passport, no American passport. And he's now in Ukraine, and there's some question as to whether he's going to try to start a third Maidan, whether they're going to have another revolution in Ukraine. It's a bizarre story. But he was our man in Georgia for a period of time, and this little conflict lasted 5 days. Initially, the world tried to blame Russia for it, but it turned out it was not Russia that started all the fighting, it was Georgia that started all the fighting. Then we get, well again, Georgia was going to become, Ukraine was going to become a part of NATO, and then there was some backing away from all of that, but other countries are still coming in. This year, the last country has come in, and you see how it's getting closer and closer and closer to Russia. Putin made a very important speech Thursday. I've looked for coverage of it, and I haven't found any coverage of it. It's not in the Washington Post, it's not in the New York Times, it's not in the Guardian. Those are the places. Has anybody seen reference to Putin's speech made on Thursday? This is a major foreign policy speech, which is not even covered in the outside world. It's not that the outside world's not there. He made the speech in front of the Valdai Club. The Valdai Club deals with international relations, and a lot of Americans are there. Timothy Colton, who's a political science at Harvard, and a friend of mine, several years ago was the moderator of a session in which Putin was one of the speakers. And Colton had to stop Putin from talking on a couple of occasions, and you can imagine that. Political scientists from Harvard telling Putin, I'm sorry, sit down, somebody else has to talk for a few minutes. But what Putin said, he said, our problem in the 1990s was that we trusted you Americans too much. Now, we believed you when you said certain kinds of things, and then you turned out not to do the things that you had told us you were going to do. And your problem is that you took our trust for weakness. You took our trust for weakness. What we need to have is respect on both sides. It was a very important speech. And if you can find it, I recommend that you read it. Interesting to me, no coverage in the first 48 hours.
Is it not in British
It wasn't in,
papers?
it was not in the Guardian. I haven't looked at other, but I read the Guardian online, and I've not been able to find it in the Guardian. I'm hoping people will now pick it up if we decide that Trump spats with this person and that person aren't more important and taking up all of the news. The financial crisis in 2008, Putin was prime minister then. Russia rode that one out pretty well. The only country maybe that rode it out better was Canada. You know, the Canadians were hardly hit by it at all. But because Russia had built up such large foreign currency reserves, they rode this crisis out fairly well. Although from reading the Western press, you would think that they were all about to collapse. Well, they weren't. They had these foreign currency holdings that they had to tap into, but they still had quite a bit of it. Then you have the Magnitsky affair. That comes Bill Browder, who's the grandson of the man who was the head of the American Communist Party for a number of years, Earl Browder, which gave him, of course, a lot of contacts fairly high up and the people who were dividing up the wealth of the former Soviet Union among themselves. Renounced his American citizenship in the 1990s and became a British subject. He heard they're giving away free money in Russia, and so he went over there, set up a big company, basically to do what the rest of them are doing, that is to buy these companies for almost nothing and then to break them up, sell off the important assets. You know, certain types of capitalists do this kind of thing. He made more than $500 million in Russia doing that kind of thing, like the other oligarchs were doing. And then apparently, he was one of Putin's biggest supporters in 2005. Big supporter of Putin. And then in 2005, suddenly he was not, his visa was not honored, and he wasn't allowed back into Russia. And he became an important critic. And the Russian government began to start looking into the financial affairs of the companies that he had run, some of which had been registered in rather odd places for big companies like that. This man, he keeps referring to him as his lawyer, but he actually did not have a law degree. He was a bookkeeper, basically. He managed the finances. Ended up being arrested for all of this. He had some serious health problems and died in prison. And Browder has made Magnitsky then his case and persuaded the United States in 2012 to pass this law which placed sanctions on some of the people close around Putin. These were the first sanctions, and they were followed by other sanctions. Browder has written a book. He wrote, the ghostwriter for it writes very well. It's a really interesting book. But there's also been a movie made that has a different point of view completely from the one that Browder gives, and Browder legally is blocking the showing of that movie in countries here and there around the world. So I'm not sure that I would take everything Browder says as being absolutely true about his case. In 2010, Russia set up BRICS. Again, some Western countries sort of laughed at it at that period of time. It was originally 3 countries, China, India, and Russia, and then they wanted to have a foot in South America, so Brazil came into it as one of the developing countries, and they wanted to have a foot in Africa, so South Africa came into it as well. And BRICS, in spite of some stumbles at the very beginning, seems to be coming along. It's still in existence. It's not one of these things that was a flash in the pan and then disappeared. Keep your eye on BRICS as we go. Of course, one of the things that made us not like Putin was that cynical transition of power when he becomes president again. And Medvedev steps down in 2012. There were all these demonstrations in Moscow over all of that. Incidentally, when the Russian president takes the oath of office, what does he put his hand on? Not a religious book, the Constitution. What a novel idea. Since that's what you're supposed to defend, why don't you put your hand on the Constitution when you're swearing that you're going to uphold it? It's an interesting idea, isn't it? To do it that way. What else can we say about what's been going on in Russia recently? Oh, the Civil War. We have Putin to thank for our not having invaded Syria right off the bat. You know, this red line sort of thing. Putin came up with a way for the United States to save face, for the chemical weapons to be destroyed, and they were destroyed on board a U.S. warship in the Mediterranean. Putin saved us from getting involved in yet another invasion of another Middle Eastern country and all of that. I'm not sure that he's fully been given credit for that early on in the Syrian civil war. Putin has defended the Syrian government. I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes if we still have time. Sochi Olympics, I don't know whether you were aware of reading about the Sochi Olympics before they happened, but the Western press universally was sure this is going to be the worst Olympics that ever happened. Everything was going to go bad, everything was screwed up. Russians couldn't do anything. I call it the Putin trope at work. For example, there were 30,000 stray dogs in Sochi, and they were going around shooting them every night. They opened manholes in Sochi, and here's a picture of one. They built toilets in which they had no barrier between the two toilets, so you could actually see what the guy was doing on the toilet next to you. They built rooms that we didn't really know what they were for. You couldn't get out of a bathroom, and so you had to smash your way through the door. Do you remember this event? An American athlete on our Olympic team actually smashed his way through that door because he was having some trouble working the door handle. And of course, this is all reported, those Russians, they can't do anything right. Well, it turned out not to be a very bad Olympics. In fact, it was highly successful Olympics. May not have been covered that way, but at the end, what could you say about it? Not that it had gone off badly, it went off quite well. In fact, yes, it was more expensive than any Olympics before, but hasn't every Olympics been more expensive than the one that came before it? And unlike the Chinese, and unlike Montreal and other places, they are still using the facilities that were created. Unlike Athens, they are using the facilities that were created for all of that. Then comes Ukraine. And this is what really turned people in the West against Russia. It's a very complicated issue. Far more complicated maybe than it was treated in our press. You have this coup d'etat that takes place when the government is overthrown after the president had agreed to have early elections, that he would not run, that he would have virtually no power in the last few months, but we're going to do this democratically, aren't we? We're going to have a peaceful transition of power, aren't we? No. The very next day, an angry mob went out to his house to try to apparently lynch him, with no opposition at all from people who had signed the agreement the day before, the United States, the European Union. He was rescued from his house, was taken to another place in Ukraine, and the announcement was immediately made, he's no longer the president. There's a new government, and the new government was the one that had been announced by Victoria Nuland a month earlier, in a telephone call to Jeffrey Pyatt. She said, we want yachts. She used nicknames for them instead of their full name. And she was asked by the U.S. ambassador to Kiev, well, what is the European Union going to think? What's Angela Merkel going to think about all of this? Because they'd like to have some other people in the new government. I mean, there was a government, let's all understand. She says, fuck the EU. These are her words. That conversation was overheard by somebody. And it was put up on YouTube, and no one ever denied that it was not a true. Angela Merkel, of course, was furious that this was the United States' attitude towards her and towards the European Union. But the United States basically put in power the people that it had wanted to put in power in Ukraine after this overthrow of the government. Not everybody in Ukraine was happy with that, particularly the people who had elected the former president. In the eastern part of the country, he'd gotten 80% of the vote. In the western part of the country, he'd gotten 20% of the vote. And now the western part of the country overthrows it. But the eastern part of the country says, wait a minute, that's not the way we do things. We have elections, don't we? And they said, we're not going to go along. We want to have some negotiations. We want to talk about things. But the western part of the country, which now controls the government, says, no, there's no negotiations. Either you go along with it, the whole thing, or we're going to invade you militarily. And that's what they did. And so fighting started. And the people in the east who weren't very happy with what had happened in this overthrow of the government, they then turned for some help to someone who might be willing to give them help, which happened to be Russia. Crimea, which had always been Russian, it had never been Ukrainian, until 1954, when Khrushchev was drunk one night, and they were celebrating the 300th anniversary of part of Ukraine coming under Moscow's control. He said, oh, what the hell, why don't I just give give Crimea to you people? Nobody ever voted on it. Khrushchev just did it one night in 1954. It had never been Ukrainian. And the percentage of the population was under 15%, even now, even in 2014. Most of the people there thought of themselves as being ethnic Russians. In the 1990s, when the country was carved up, they wanted to go back to Russia. They wanted to be part of Russia. And Ukraine said, oh, no, you're ours now. The current Ukrainian government has decided that it wants nothing to do with the entire Soviet period. Anything that was done in the Soviet period, they're doing away with it. Absolutely anything. Cities were renamed? No. We're going to do away with the Soviet names of cities. Statues of Lenin? No. We've taken down all 1,200 statues of Lenin in the entire country. But if someone asks the question, excuse me a little bit, at the end of World War II, wasn't Ukraine given a good bit of territory that had belonged to Poland before that? That had never been Ukraine before? Wasn't this something done under Soviet power? Shouldn't you maybe give this back to Poland? No, that question hasn't come up. Or anything that was done under Soviet power was bad and we have to do away with it. Well, excuse me, in 1954, didn't you get Crimea? Shouldn't Crimea maybe be given back to Russia, where it had always been before? Oh, no, it's ours now. We got it now, it's ours. So you see, you do what you want to do. You don't do what you don't want to do. And so Crimea, people in Crimea are very happy that they're now a part of Russia. They voted initially to become independent and then very quickly to become a part of Russia. We have friends in Crimea. Our friend called her mother who lives there and she said, Mom, are people happy? And she says, no, people aren't happy. And her daughter says, what do you mean people aren't happy? And she says, happy doesn't go far enough. People are ecstatic that we are now a part of Russia once again. But you don't hear about that in the Western press. And so, yeah, we agree. There's the, whoops, excuse me. Uh-oh, I've done it again. There's the, come on. The voting pattern I was going to show you. I didn't show you the voting pattern. We keep going from farther and farther and farther. It doesn't go backwards. It's not going backwards. Now I've shut the whole thing off. We split 50-50. Now that's when it's really important to let the democratic process solve everything, not to let one side overthrow the other side and then totally ignore their wishes. And you see how heavily Crimea has voted for the guy who was perceived as being the one more friendly to Moscow. Don't have time to get into LH17. I'm sorry, there's a picture. And so sanctions and sanctions and sanctions are piled on sanctions. And we're still putting sanctions on them for what? I'm not sure what they're doing that's actually new, but we're still putting sanctions on Russia. Some Russian farmers are really happy with the sanctions. They say, life's never been better for us. They said, please don't take them off. Some of them have written, in fact, letters to the editor of newspapers saying, tell the Western Europeans not to take off the sanctions we like, though. And of course, Putin is espousing, and Russia is now standing more for what we would consider to be traditional values, not so much the values that people would follow today. This is a real family, says that thing. You know, mommy, daddy, one's female, one's male, and you got several little children. Putin does consult fairly regularly with people in the Russian Orthodox Church, but it's not only the Russian Orthodox Church. Putin also is very kindly towards, let's say, Islam. The Islamic leaders in Russia say it's never been a better time to be a Muslim in Russia. Russia also has excellent relations with Israel for the first time ever in its history. Russians could go to Israel without getting a visa. Israelis can go to Russia without getting a visa. They're on a visa-less system. We're not. And Putin has also he's always insisted on rule of law, rule of the Constitution. Now you have to interpret them, and we would say twist them, but he still says, no, you have to do things according to rule of law. And this helps explain a lot of his behavior, I think. This is a poster that I saw up on a street sign telling people don't take bribes and don't offer bribes, reminding them of how many years you can get in prison for offering bribes, quoting from the legal code of Russia, the rule of law. So when he went to the G20 meeting in Australia, do you remember this one? He was treated as a pariah. They barely even let him in the photograph. Here he was way over on the side. And who was it? The Prime Minister of Australia said he was going to, I forget what the Australian term is, but basically he meant, smash his chest and all this kind of stuff. And he left early, as they all told us, but he said, but Angela Merkel left before I did, and so on and so on and so on. We missed this Victory Day, which I talked about the one from 2016. We missed it in 2015 because we were snubbing the Russians, the 70th anniversary of the end of the war. No Western leader went. Bill Clinton went in 1995, George Bush went in 2005, but Obama did not go in 2015, and we persuaded the Germans not to go, although Merkel went the next day and did something. But there were a bunch of world leaders there, and I watched the whole thing on television, and the President Xi of China was right next to Putin. These guys were touching each other virtually the entire day. On Tuesday, this happened on Sunday, on Tuesday, John Kerry, Secretary of State, flew to Sochi to talk to Putin because he realized, uh-oh, things are patching between Russia and China. And there were other world leaders there at the time as well, and troops from various armies were also there to celebrate the whole thing. Putin made a speech in front of the United Nations in September of 2015, in which he said, what we really need to do is all of the powers who are concerned about terrorism, we need to get together and have a common approach to how we're going to defeat this terrorism that confronts all of us. And he was virtually ignored in what he had to say. So a few days later, Russia decided it would start to do things in its own way. And this was all poo-pooed by the United States. The US president said they're getting themselves in a morass they can't get out of. But now the situation is, it seems, fairly nearly resolved in Syria. We'll see what happens in the future. And then, of course, election interference. And I wondered, how much should I say about this in my talk? I don't have to say anything, do I? Because we're nearly done. But you've been hearing a lot about it. Have you got the stuff in the last couple of days? Apparently Republicans in Congress are trying to turn all of this inquest now against the Clintons. This purchase by a Canadian corporation which has close ties to a Russian corporation, Rosatom, 20% of the United States uranium, which is now perhaps owned partially, maybe by Russia. And at about the same time that happened, there was a $145 million gift made by some Russians to the Clinton Foundation. Check the newspaper tomorrow morning. The Republicans may be turning this around on the Democrats. Rather interesting. And that original hack, from what I understand, the original hack of the DNC computer may have been impossible to do as a hack. It may have only been possible to do to get that much information in that short a period of time if you're sitting right there and plugging into the computer. Stay tuned. A lot of interesting stuff yet to be learned. But there's some funny stuff here. This is a Russian cartoon. This is called Russophobia. And Uncle Sam is jumping out of the TV screen, and he's force-feeding this guy who's sitting there, and he said, "The Russians are coming!" He's force-feeding this, and the Russians are coming, and the guy says, "I've had enough." Already that point's pretty funny. There are world leaders who still think fairly highly of Putin. Who would have thought 2 years ago that Erdogan shot down a Russian fighter jet? You know, they were about to go to war with each other, and now they've become close buddies. Modi in India, very close contacts. India was always fairly close to Russia. We got Pakistan. We thought we had a better deal, I'm not sure. And then of course with Xi, yes. Who would have thought last week that the king of Saudi Arabia would go to Moscow and sign a deal for all kinds of economic assistance? $1 billion worth of help coming from Saudi Arabian construction companies for Russia. Who would have thought? Apparently Saudi Arabia is not quite so sure anymore about its American alliance, and it's looking for some possibilities in other parts of the world. Interesting to see how things may be changing. The economy, this has been a very good year for Russia. Russia, once again, is the world's top exporter of wheat this year. 2 years ago, it was the top exporter of wheat. They fell to third place last year. Once again this year, they're top place exporter of wheat. Russia is buying up more gold than anybody else in the world except the Chinese. We owe scads of money. How many trillion now? 20 trillion? Russia's debt-free. They don't owe anything to anybody. And they're building up foreign currency reserves. And the Russian economy is now, it's turned everything around, and they are now expected to be growing over the next 2 or 3 years. Not really fast, but the Russian economy is no longer shrinking after what happened with the sinking in oil prices and so on. And of course, in spite of what various countries are trying to do to prevent this gas line being built under the Baltic Sea, Nord Stream is probably going to be built, Nord Stream, so that Russia can provide gas directly to Germany. These latest sanctions by the United States are directed specifically against companies that might participate in that construction. So our companies are trying to stop Russia and Germany from doing this in all kinds of ways, including sanctions. Well, they do make fun of of Putin in Russia. I was in a small town in Russia and I saw this on sale. Putin is dressed as a Caesar. And the other one, they'd even put a little fur hat on his head. They have a comedy club on a night program, and this guy, Khrushchev, plays Putin. And you see Putin here with Trump. Oh, it's really funny. This guy played something. He sits down, he's unhappy, and Putin's trying to make him smile. And Putin says to him, come on, tell me a funny story about something. He goes, okay. He said, a while back I was with these two women. He said, no, I better not tell that one. And the Putin character says, oh, I know that one. He knows everything. Here he is with the head of Chechnya. Here he is with the head of China, and so on and so on and so on. With Putin, with Trump. Trump is saying to him, watch this. NATO, boom, NATO, boom, NATO, boom, NATO, boom, NATO, boom. You get the idea? And the Putin character says, watch this. He says, boom. Trump says, what's that? And he says, well, that's just a grasshopper. The grasshopper is jumping across, and he lands in a pile of cow manure. And then he leaves, and Trump calls somebody on the phone, and he says, find out if the Russians have a rocket called Grasshopper. And find out where the American city is. It's called cow manure. Up until this time, they've been on the phone, and Trump says, well, I want to see you pretty soon. And says, Putin says, oh, yeah, you will. I'll see you really soon. They hang up the phone, and Putin, a second later, walks in. And Trump says, how do you do that? Weren't you in Moscow? He says, I was in Moscow. He said, how do you do that? He said, oh, we've got this fighter plane. And Trump says, really? You have a fighter plane like that? He said, no, just kidding. And then he says, Putin just starts to tell him something else. And Trump says, really? And he says, no, just kidding. The fighter plane, though, that's a true story. And they go on and on and on. So they are making fun of him in certain ways, his knowing everything, being omniscient and all of that. We have our view, they have their view, right? And here you've got a bunch of guys in SEAL training. They're all filthy dirty, they've been rubbling in the mud and all the rest. And you got a Russian grandma who's getting ready to cut the winter's firewood. Something that I saw on a Russian website. And of course, Putin's approval ratings are to die for. They're still over 80%. This has taken him through the last X number of years. He's been extremely popular. The red line is his government. The government's not been as popular as he has, but he's been very popular. People in Russia see him as having brought something to the country, giving them a sense of themselves once again, a sense of pride in being Russian. Be prepared, which was the Boy Scout motto and also the motto of the KGB. And you're strong, Uncle Volodya, he says, feeling his muscles. But are you ready for this one? That's RT. Okay, RT, which stole the elections, as you remember, because of spending $100,000 in ads after the election. But this is an old portrait of Stalin. He dedicated a monument last April to a Grand Duke, one of the Romanovs, who was blown up by revolutionaries in 1905. And he was highly critical of revolution as a way of solving problems. He said, revolution caused us in Russia horrible, horrible difficulties. We need to return to more significant things, more significant roots than that. And he says, today we should say again that we have only one Russia, and no matter what our individual views and positions, we must all defend and look after this Russia, make our people's future, the happiness of our people and our children and grandchildren our priority. Which is not a view that we usually have. Remember, Yeltsin said, take care of Russia. And he's, in a sense, echoing that here. So, if we could have the lights turned up. FIFA is going to be in Russia next year, and this is the symbol that they've chosen. So you might be seeing that if we decide to show the World Cup after all. Yes?
What about the rumor, or many people say that Putin is the richest, one of the richest, if not the richest?
Yeah, Putin's the richest person in the world, that's right. He's got, how many billion is it? 200 billion? 400 billion?
No, but it's for him.
Browder said
He asked
400
me to
billion.
take it.
Yeah, Bill Gates has what, 89? building,
ask him?
Putin doesn't need
Yeah,
money.
you probably should ask him.
Now, all the houses that he
Because
lives
I
in, they're owned by
probably
the
put some
government.
on YouTube, but
The government houses.
not for everyone.
I don't know that
Maybe
house
we'll
spy
put it
agencies have
on
found
the-
his wealth.
Yeah, you should ask
If they
him.
have found his
Because
wealth, I know
I would
they've been
like to
looking for it
invite
for a
some
long
people
time,
who
and if
are
they have
safe.
found his wealth, they're not
Yeah, he probably
telling
just
anybody
put
they
it just
found his
this
wealth. So if it's
Because
out
it's
there,
extremely
I'm not sure where it
enlightening.
is.
It's changed
And what
my
I see taking
worldview.
place in
Yeah, it's
Russia,
true.
I mean, we're told that he and the people around him are stealing 20% of the whole GDP or something like this.
Yeah.
But I see so much going on in Russia when I
We're
travel across the
informed
country. I see so much
by
infrastructure improvements.
sources
Brand new
that
airports, brand
don't
new railroad
have-
lines, brand new subway stops, and all this kind of thing.
Don't have a
In
contact
Vladivostok,
that
building
has.
those new bridges, building that new
Contact
ocean
that
area. This is
has.
in Vladivostok, which is way out in the middle of the
propaganda.
You know, I don't see how that could happen if Putin is putting all the money in his pocket.
It's all
I
about
mean, they may be
fear.
rich, but
It's all about fear, but not
maybe the
respect.
politician who retires
And
poor.
the speeches that I've seen him give, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the text, wow, the very reason, the one that was supposedly anti-American, wasn't anti-American at all. He was talking about reason.
Right.
Yeah, and he's exactly the guy to say that, isn't he?
Well, I know he's extremely smart,
Khodorkovsky
but
is,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, well, let me
He's
talk.
quite a bit. Yes,
I'll
sir.
wait till all this is over.
Yeah, but he will give it to you. I mean, it's,
The state of political dissent in Russia right now. Well, there's
Let
this,
me
there
give
are
you in
radio
advance of
programs,
his
there are
saying
TV
yes, let me
programs.
give you my
There is the
name and
internet.
address and telephone number.
Russia doesn't control the internet
And
anymore.
then if he doesn't,
You can post
yes, I'll
anything on
tell
the
you.
internet if you want to. There are a number of people who are highly critical of Putin. Navalny, for example, this blogger who is posing as someone who would like to run for president for the next time around. But these people have virtually no cachet with most of the population of Russia. There are some of the intelligentsia in Moscow who support them, but outside of those people, they can't poll in public opinion polls. Well, would you vote for this guy today? Oh yeah, 6% say they will. 10% say they will. But it's not any more than that. But people can say, they can say anything they want to. Television channels are pretty much government controlled, but there are critical things that come across on some of the television channels. And there are these comical programs. You do see caricatures of Putin from time to time. They don't put them up on walls of buildings. You know, somebody will they'll take them down, or overpaint them right away. But they tell Putin jokes. You could never tell a Stalin joke. You get 5 years for that. But people tell Putin jokes. And so in terms of political dissent, what exactly do you mean by political consent? I mean, that's dissent. That's part of what we have to deal with. Are there people who are opposed to the people who have power and would like to have power themselves? Yes, that's true in every country. I'd like to have the power myself. But in terms of the vast majority of the population, Russia is tolerant of other voices. Let me tell you a story about a man named Pavlinsky. Pavlinsky was an opponent of the Putin regime.
that's good.
He was a performance artist. So what Pavlinsky decided to do, to show his dislike of the Putin regime, he went to Red Square one fine day, he took off all of his clothes, and he nailed his scrotum to Red Square. What would happen to you if you did that in Times Square in the United States? You'd be probably sent for psychiatric supervision, right? They said, you know, unnail yourself and put on your clothes and go home. And he did. Another time he sewed his mouth shut. You know, he walked around for a couple of days with his mouth sewed shut. Another day, he was walking past the FSB building, the former KGB building, and he thought, oh, I think I'd like to throw a Molotov cocktail at this building. And so he made himself a Molotov cocktail, and he threw it up against one of the doors of this building, and he started a fire.
That's an R.
What do you think they did with it?
That's an R.
What would happen to you if you did this to the FBI building in Washington? What did they do with him? They sent him for psychiatric observation. And they said, no, this guy's not crazy, he's just weird. And they turned him loose. And they turned him loose. He very recently decided that Russia was just a horrible place and he couldn't live there anymore, so I'm moving to France. He moved to France, he has no job, he has no money. So he found an empty house, and he and his wife occupied this empty house. They're not paying any rent, they're just living in somebody else's house. They asked him, what do you live on? He said, I just go to grocery stores and I steal food. He said, I just take whatever's in the grocery store and take it home and eat it. He said, you wouldn't believe how lax the laws are in this country. Well, he tried the same thing there. He lit a Molotov cocktail and threw it against the door of a bank in France. He's now in a psychiatric hospital. Okay? So this is one person who is well known as being an oppositionist. Don't even get me started on Pussy Riot, because I would have to use language that I would rather not use. But part of the problem with the opposition in Russia is nobody can take them very seriously because they seem to be so bizarre in some ways. You know, we've overstayed our welcome already, I think. I thank you so much for allowing me to